The math of the American empire just broke. In a silent boardroom inside the Eccles building, a digital counter flickered, and a century of financial dominance hit a wall. As of late 2024, the United States national debt officially crossed the $35 trillion mark. But that isn't the headline. The real forensic evidence of the trap is the interest. For the first time in history, the cost of servicing this debt, simply paying the interest, has skyrocketed to over $1 trillion annually. To understand the gravity of this invisible threshold, you have to look at what we've sacrificed to maintain the illusion. This $1 trillion interest bill now officially exceeds the entire U.S. defense budget. We are now spending more on the ghost of money already spent than on the literal protection of the realm. This isn't a policy debate. It's a mathematical trap. When interest payments outpace the very machinery of national security, the currency has entered a terminal debt spiral. The Federal Reserve is no longer fighting inflation. They are fighting for the survival of the Treasury. This mirrors the terminal stages of the Weimar Republic, where the mechanism of printing to pay interest became the only lever left to pull. In 1920s Germany, they hit this same wall, the point where productivity couldn't keep up with the interest on the paper. Today, the trap is being set for the 90%. While the media focuses on retail bull runs, the CBO, Congressional Budget Office projections show that by 2026, the interest on our debt will consume every single dollar of individual income tax revenue collected. Your taxes won't build roads. They won't pay for soldiers. They will be funneled directly into the black hole of debt service. This is the wealth reset. The mechanism is designed to hollow out your purchasing power to keep the ledger balanced. Most investors are looking for growth, but they are walking into a deleveraging event that has been a century in the making. The gears of the global timepiece are shifting, and 90% of you are standing directly in the way of the teeth. Behind the mahogany doors of the world's most powerful central banks, they don't use the word theft. They use the word target, specifically the 2% inflation target. But while the 90% are busy celebrating a 10% return in their brokerage accounts, the forensic reality reveals something far more sinister. Your portfolio isn't growing. It's being liquidated in real time by a mechanism designed to be invisible. This is the statistical mirage, the primary bait for the 2026 trap. The financial industry has conditioned you to buy and hold. They tell you that time in the market beats timing the market. But in a debased currency environment, buy and hold is actually hold and lose. As of late 2025, the M2 money supply in the United States hit a record-breaking $22.3 trillion. This isn't just a number on a spreadsheet. It is a direct measurement of how much more paper is competing for the same amount of real-world goods. When the supply of dollars expands by 5% to 8% annually, your 10% gain isn't a profit. It's a desperate attempt to break even. To see the trap clearly, we have to perform a fiscal forensic comparison between official data and reality. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, BLS, recently reported a 2.7% CPI inflation rate. However, alternative measures, like those tracking the actual cost of housing, energy, and medical care, suggest the real erosion of purchasing power is closer to 12% or 15%. If your portfolio made 10%, but the cost of your life increased by 15%, you didn't win. You lost 5% of your total net worth. You are mathematically poorer than you were a year ago, despite the higher numbers on your screen. This mechanism mirrors the collapse of Rome's denarius. In the 1st century, the silver content of the denarius was nearly 100%. By the time of the crisis of the 3rd century, it was less than 5%. The Roman citizens saw more coins in their pockets, but those coins bought less wheat every single month. Today, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet has ballooned from under $1 trillion in 2008 to over $8 trillion in 2025. This is the modern debasement. The statistical mirage is the belief that nominal growth equals real wealth. The trap is set for 2026 because that is the year the maturity wall of corporate debt hits its peak. Over $1.5 trillion in commercial debt must be refinanced at these new, higher, debased rates. Small investors are being told to stay the course, while the FDIC reports show U.S. banks are sitting on $517 billion in unrealized losses. The elite are not holding. They are rotating into hard assets that exist outside the digital ledger. They know that when the 90% finally realize they've been chasing a mirage, the exit door will already be locked. Your bank account is not a vault. It is a melting ice cube. Every month, the Fed keeps interest rates below the real inflation rate. They are performing a forced wealth transfer from your savings to their debt. This is the invisible tax. By the time 2026 arrives, 90% of investors will find themselves holding a mountain of paper that no longer buys a molehill of security. The timepiece is ticking, and the mirage is starting to flicker. A physical deadline exists for the current financial era. While the media debates soft landings and interest rate pivots, a mathematical executioner is sharpening its blade in the shadows of the commercial credit market. We call it the maturity wall. By the end of 2026, well over $1.5 trillion in U.S. commercial real estate debt will come due. This isn't just a number on a spreadsheet. It is a $1.5 trillion bomb with a fuse that was lit when interest rates were near zero. Now those loans are hitting a wall of high-interest reality, and the banks holding the bills are starting to sweat. The forensic evidence of this trap is hidden in the extend and pretend strategy lenders have used for the last 24 months. Banks didn't want to realize the losses on vacant office towers and hollowed-out retail centers, so they simply modified terms, hoping rates would crash back to earth. They didn't. Instead, these extended loans have crowded into the 2026 window. We are looking at triple the volume of maturing debt in 2026 compared to the previous cycle. This is the collision point where the illusion of solvency meets the reality of the market. The trap for the 90% of investors is the exposure of regional banks. Unlike the too-big-to-fail giants, regional and local banks account for 150% to 228% of their total risk exposure in commercial real estate. According to recent FDIC data, U.S. banks are already sitting on $517 billion in unrealized losses. If even 10% of these $1.5 trillion in loans default, hundreds of banks will fall below their capitalization requirements. Your local bank is essentially a highly leveraged bet on office spaces that no one wants to work in anymore. This mirrors the Florida land boom of the 1920s. Back then, easy credit and speculation drove property values to quadruple in months. By 1926, the bubble didn't just leak, it exploded, leaving behind entirely new towns that were bankrupt before the first house was finished. The 1926 Florida collapse was the canary in the coal mine for the 1929 Great Depression. Today, The 2026 maturity wall is our canary. The MSCI expects a massive surge in foreclosures, specifically in the apartment and multifamily sectors, as 60% of loans made during the 2021-2022 cheap money era hit their expiration date simultaneously. Most investors believe they are diversified because they own index funds. But those funds are anchored by the very banks that are about to hit this wall. When the maturity wall forces the first major domino to fall, the liquidity will vanish instantly. The elite are already exiting, rotating into hard assets and private credit that exists outside this debt trap. They know that when the wall hits, the 90% will be left holding the bill for a century of cheap money that finally became too expensive to keep. The timepiece is winding down to the second, and 2026 is the moment the gears finally seize. The gears of this system are turning faster than the headlines can report. Most people will wait until the reset is complete to start asking questions. But by then, the timepiece will have already struck zero. If you find this investigation valuable, hit the like button and share this video with someone who still believes their savings are safe in a debasing currency. Your support helps us bypass the algorithm and bring these hidden financial mechanisms to light. Leave a comment below with the word time if you're ready to see the final phase of this year blueprint. And finally, subscribe to join the 10% who are mastering the lessons time insists we keep learning. Now back to the forensics. The most accurate warning light in the history of finance just stopped blinking. After 793 consecutive days submerged in negative territory, the longest stretch of its kind ever recorded in the American ledger, the yield curve has finally uninverted. But while Wall Street celebrates this as a return to normalcy, the forensic reality is far more terrifying. In the dark history of global credit, the uninversion is not the end of the crisis. It is the arrival of the crash. To see the trap, you must look at the last time the gears of credit ground to such a violent halt. You have to look at 1929. Just months before the Great Liquidation, the yield curve performed the exact same maneuver we are witnessing today. It flashed. It strained under the pressure of tight money, and then it snapped back to a positive slope. The 90% saw the normalization as a sign that the worst was over. In reality, that flash was the sound of the structural supports of the economy finally giving way. Recent data from late 2024 and 2025 confirms that we have officially broken the record set during the Great Depression era. This isn't just another cycle, it is a mathematical anomaly. When short-term money costs more than long-term stability for over 2 years, the banking system's engine begins to seize. The spread between the 2-year and 10-year Treasury, the primary signal, has just shifted into a bull steepening phase. History shows us that a recession doesn't start while the curve is inverted. It starts almost immediately after it uninverts. In 2007, the curve normalized in March. The Great Recession was visible by year-end. In 2000, it flipped in December. The dot-com crash followed in months. Today, the trap is the belief that the soft landing has been achieved because the curve is positive again. But look at the FDIC's most recent reports. They're tracking $517 billion in unrealized losses across the U.S. banking sector. These losses were frozen while the curve was inverted. Now that short-term rates are finally falling and the curve is steepening, these losses are becoming liquid. This is the wealth reset trigger. The banks that survived the inversion are the very ones that will collapse during the yuan inversion. The 10% are watching the term premium, the extra compensation investors demand for holding long-term debt. As of late 2025, this premium is surging as the world realizes the U.S. government is issuing trillions in new bonds to pay the interest on the old ones. This is the same debt spiral that hollowed out the British Empire after its post-war peak. You are currently living inside the normalization trap. While you are told the water is safe, the forensic data proves that the uninversion of 2025 is merely the precursor to the reset of 2026. The timepiece has reached its final hour. The FDIC bank solvency secret. The numbers inside your banking app are a lie. They represent a promise, not a reality. While you sleep, the institution holding your life savings is quietly bleeding out from a wound it refuses to acknowledge in public. This is the unrealized loss trap, a mathematical black hole that has reached a staggering $337 billion of late 2024 and early 2025. This forensic data, pulled directly from the FDIC's quarterly banking profile, reveals a banking system teetering on the edge of technical insolvency. These aren't hypothetical projections. They are the cold, hard difference between what banks paid for their treasury bonds and what those bonds are actually worth today in a high-interest world. The banks are sitting on a mountain of paper losses. If you try to withdraw your money all at once, they have to sell these bonds at a massive discount, turning a paper loss into a bank failure. In short, your bank account is not a vault. It is a high-risk loan to an insolvent entity. This mechanism mirrors the final days of the Weimar Republic's banking sector. Back then, banks were stuffed with government debt that was losing value every hour. The public believed their deposits were safe until the moment the holiday was declared. Today, the Bank for International Settlements, BIS, and the IMF are raising alarms about the shadow banking sector, but the 90% remain distracted by stock market peaks. They don't see the FDIC's problem bank list, which has surged to include dozens of institutions holding billions in total assets. The trap for 2026 is being set through accounting tricks. Regulators have allowed banks to classify these failing assets as held to maturity, meaning they don't have to report the loss as long as they never sell. But the 2025 $1.5 trillion commercial debt wall we discussed earlier is the force that will compel them to sell. When the defaults hit, the banks will need liquidity. They will reach into the vault, but they'll find only the ghost of the money that was already lost to inflation and bad bets. You are being told your money is safe up to $250,000, but in a systemic reset, that insurance fund is a drop in a $20 trillion bucket. The forensic reality is that the banking system is currently a giant carry trade gone wrong. By the time the 90% realize that their cash is just a digital entry backed by depreciating debt, the elite will have already moved their capital into hard assets and private credit. The timepiece is nearing its strike. Your bank isn't holding your money. It's holding its breath. And in 2026, the air is going to run out. The elite exodus following the 1%. The lights are burning late on the 50th floor, but the trading desks are empty. While retail investors are glued to their screens, hypnotized by the green candles of a manipulated bull run, the architects of the system are quietly stepping through the back exit. They aren't shouting warnings. They are signing 13F filings. This is the elite exodus, the moment when the smart money stops playing the game and starts preparing for the aftermath. To see the trap, you have to follow the paper trail of the most successful predator in the history of capital, Warren Buffett. In late 2024 and throughout 2025, Berkshire Hathaway performed a financial maneuver that should have sent a chill through every brokerage account in America. Buffett didn't just trim his positions. He performed a surgical extraction. He liquidated massive stakes in the very pillars of the American economy, Apple and Bank of America. The result? A record-breaking cash pile of $325.2 billion. Buffett isn't waiting for a deal. He is holding $1/3 trillion in liquid dry powder because he knows the current valuation of the S&P 500 is a statistical impossibility. This isn't the first time the elite have vanished before a slaughter. We have to bridge this to 1929. History remembers the shoeshine boy giving stock tips, but the forensic reality is found in the actions of Joseph Kennedy. Kennedy famously exited the market entirely in the summer of 1929. He didn't do it because of a gut feeling. He did it because he saw the dumb money flooding in while the structural integrity of the banks was failing. Today, the 90% are being told that cash is trash, while the leaders of the tech revolution are dumping their own shares at a pace not seen since the dot-com peak. In 2024 and early 2025, Jeff Bezos liquidated over $5 billion in Amazon stock. Mark Zuckerberg offloaded nearly $500 million in Meta shares. Jensen Huang of NVIDIA, the poster child of the current AI-fueled mania, has been selling hundreds of millions in stock through pre-arranged trading plans. They are cashing out their chips while the floor is still crowded. The trap is being set using the 13F filing lag. These documents are a rear-view mirror, filed 45 days after the quarter ends. By the time you read that an elite hedge fund has exited a position, they have been out for months. But the forensic stressor isn't just what they are selling, it's what they aren't buying. According to the IMF's latest Global Financial Stability Report, there is a massive liquidity vacuum in the private credit markets. The elite are rotating into special situations and distressed debt. They are waiting for the 2026 maturity wall to break the 90% so they can buy the wreckage for pennies. The Federal Reserve's own data on the wealth of the top 1% shows a massive shift into Treasury bills and liquid equivalents. They are effectively lending money back to the government at 5% while the 90% are gambling on 25x earnings multiples in a stagnant economy. This is a forced wealth transfer. The elite are using the current market strength to bridge themselves into the next system, while leaving the retail investor to hold the bag of a debasing currency. Your bank account is being used as a liquidity pool for their exit. When the 2026 reset triggers, the smart money won't be in the path of the teeth. They will be the ones holding the timepiece, waiting for the gears to stop so they can wind them back up in their favor. The warning isn't coming from the news. It's coming from the 13F filings. They are telling you the exit is closing, and 90% of you are still walking toward the center of the room. The bricks bridge infrastructure. While the Western public is distracted by the volatility of the S&P 500, a parallel financial architecture is being completed in the East. This is the bridge project, a multi-central bank digital currency CBDC platform designed specifically to bypass the US dollar and the SWIFT messaging system. For decades, the US dollar has maintained its reserve status through the petrodollar agreement. But the forensic evidence of 2024 and 2025 reveals that the agreement has not just expired. It has been replaced by a digital Noah's Ark for the BRICS nations. In late 2024, the Bank for International Settlements, BIS, announced the minimum viable product status of mBridge. This isn't a pilot program anymore. It is an active mechanism allowing China, the UAE, Thailand, and Hong Kong to settle massive cross-border trades in seconds without ever touching a single U.S. Treasury bond. This is the structural drain of the dollar's dominance. Every transaction settled on mBridge is liquidity that has permanently left the American banking system. The trap for the 90% is the belief that the dollar is too big to fail. But history shows us a different pattern. We have to bridge this to the British pound's loss of reserve status after World War II. In 1944, at Bretton Woods, the pound was the king of global trade. By 1956, during the Suez Crisis, the U.S. used the pound's debt-heavy position to force a liquidation. Today, the roles are reversed. The IMF now reports that global central bank reserves of U.S. dollars have dropped to a 25-year low, while the BRICS bloc has grown to represent over 35% of global GDP. The forensic stressor is the recent pilot of the unit, a gold-backed settlement instrument launched by BRICS in late 2025. By anchoring their new trade system to hard assets rather than the full faith and credit of a debt-soaked U.S. government, they are building a wall against the 2026 reset. While 90% of American investors are betting on a digital ledger backed by $35 trillion in debt, the East is quietly building a vault backed by the very gold the U.S. confiscated in 1933. Your purchasing power depends on the world needing dollars to buy oil and grain. If the mBridge system allows the world to buy those same goods with a gold-backed digital token, the demand for the U.S. dollar evaporates. The forensic reality is that the U.S. is currently in stage 5 of the collapse pattern, the loss of the reserve currency status. When the demand stops, the inflation that we've been exporting to the rest of the world for 50 years will come rushing back home all at once in 2026. The digital dollar beta test. The transition didn't start with a fanfare or a public vote. It started with a quiet update to the banking rails under the name FedNow. While the public was told this was about convenience and instant payments, the forensic reality reveals a much darker blueprint. This is the beta test for the programmable dollar. By late 2024 and throughout 2025, the Federal Reserve successfully integrated over 1,000 financial institutions into this real-time payment network. But the mechanism is not about speed. It is about the on-off switch for your financial life. To see the trap, you have to look at the legal framework being built while you are distracted by stock market highs. Executive Order 11067, which directed the research into a U.S. central bank digital currency, CBDC, was only the first step. By late 2025, the quiet expansion of the mBridge project, the multi-CBDC platform we discussed earlier, began to sync with Western real-time systems. This is the creation of a global digital cage. Unlike the physical cash in your wallet, a digital dollar settled through FedNow is a direct liability of the Federal Reserve. This means your wealth is no longer private property. It is a permissioned entry on a central ledger. This mechanism mirrors the Executive Order 6102 of 1933, when the U.S. government outlawed the private ownership of gold. Back then, they needed your physical metal to back the failing paper. Today, they need your digital compliance to back the failing debt. The trap is being set for 2026 because that is when the physical cash supply is scheduled for a radical optimization. The Bank for International Settlements, BIS, has recently released papers detailing the efficiency of programmable money. Money that can be programmed with an expiration date or restricted from being spent on certain high-carbon or socially misaligned goods. Most investors believe a digital dollar is just faster Venmo. They are walking into a system of total financial surveillance. Under the current ISO 2022 standard being adopted globally in 2025, every transaction now carries massive amounts of data about the sender, the receiver, and the purpose of the purchase. The 90% are celebrating the end of bank holidays and waiting for checks to clear, unaware that they are trading their financial sovereignty for a digital voucher system. When the 2026 wealth reset triggers, the exit from the banking system won't just be difficult. It will be mathematically impossible without the central bank's permission. The Weimar Paradox, Stage 5 Analysis. The stock market ticker is screaming in gold, but the underlying currency is bleeding out in red. To the untrained eye, the record-breaking heights of the S&P 500 in late 2024 and 2025 look like a victory for the American economy. In reality, this is the Weimar Paradox, a historical phenomenon where a skyrocketing stock market is not a sign of prosperity, but the final frantic gasp of a dying currency. While the 90% celebrate their 401k gains, the forensic investigator sees a massive liquidity melt-up driven by the debasement of the dollar. To see the trap, we must bridge the current U.S. market to the hyperinflationary peak of the Weimar Republic in 1922 and 1923. Back then, German stocks were hitting all-time highs every single day. Investors felt like geniuses as their portfolios doubled, tripled, and quadrupled in months. But there was a catch. While the stocks went up by 1,000%, the price of bread went up by 10,000%. The gains were a mathematical illusion. The currency was losing value faster than the companies could grow. Today, the Federal Reserve's M2 money supply has rebounded to a record $22.3 trillion as of late 2025. This isn't corporate growth. It is a tidal wave of paper looking for a place to hide. The forensic evidence of this trap is found in the valuation gap. According to the IMF's 2025 Financial Stability Report, U.S. equity valuations have decoupled from earnings at a rate not seen since the 1999 dot-com bubble. But this time, it's not just speculation, it's preservation. High net worth individuals are not buying stocks because they love the companies. They are buying them because they are terrified of holding cash that is losing 15% of its real purchasing power annually. The stock market has become a giant exit ramp for a failing currency. This mechanism is what we call the crack-up boom. It occurs when the public finally realizes that the central bank will never stop printing money to cover the interest on the national debt. In this stage, everyone rushes to exchange their paper currency for anything else: stocks, real estate, or hard assets. This frantic buying drives prices into the stratosphere, creating a fake sense of wealth. However, as the Bank for International Settlements, BIS, has recently warned, this melt-up is always followed by a sudden stop. When the 2026 reset triggers, the exit door from these inflated assets will be too narrow for the 90% to escape. The trap is being set by making you feel richer while you are becoming poorer. If your portfolio goes up by 10%, but the maturity wall of 2026 causes a 20% spike in the cost of debt and living, you have been liquidated by 10% without realizing it. You are walking into a wealth reset where the number stays high, but the value is deleted. The timepiece is striking the hour of the great mirage. Those who understand the Weimar paradox know that the higher the market climbs on a pile of debt, the more violent the fall into reality will be. The American middle class is not failing by accident. It is being liquidated by design. While the nightly news broadcasts record highs for the Dow and the Nasdaq, a forensic audit of the average American household reveals a structural hollowing out that has no precedent. We are witnessing the final phase of a decades-long wealth transfer where home equity and life savings, the twin pillars of middle-class stability, are being systematically harvested to collateralize a failing national ledger. This is the liquidation event that precedes the 2026 reset. The forensic evidence of this trap is found in the current state of U.S. household debt, which hit a staggering $18.59 trillion in late 2025. But the real stressor isn't the debt itself. It is the erosion of the real value behind it. According to the S&P Core Logic Case-Shiller Index, home price growth has officially fallen below the real inflation rate as of late 2025. For the first time in a generation, homeowners are watching their real wealth decline even as nominal prices inch higher. You see a higher number on your Zestimate, but that number buys you less coal, less grain, and less gold than it did 18 months ago. You are losing equity in real terms while paying record-high property taxes on the phantom gains. To understand the mechanism of this liquidation, we must bridge today's crisis to the crisis of the 3rd century in Rome. Back then, the imperial government could no longer fund its massive debt and military via traditional taxes. They began a process of forced requisitions, seizing the grain, property, and savings of the middle-tier citizens to keep the state's gears turning. Today, the requisition is digital. The FDIC and the Fed are presiding over a system where the personal saving rate has plummeted to 4.4%, a level lower than the 2010s and even the 1960s. Your savings are being hollowed out by a 15% real inflation rate that the official CPI refuses to track. The trap is being set using the home equity trap. Trillions of dollars in middle-class wealth are locked in primary residences. By keeping mortgage rates high, forecasted to remain near 6.7% through the end of 2025, the system has frozen the housing market. You cannot sell without losing your low interest rate, so you stay put while inflation eats the value of the dollars you used to pay for the house. Simultaneously, credit card debt has surged to $1.3 trillion. The middle class is being forced to spend their equity just to maintain their standard of living. By 2026, when the maturity wall triggers a banking liquidity squeeze, these households will find their emergency funds are gone and their homes are unmarketable. Most investors believe the record-breaking stock market is their safety net. They are walking into the ultimate signal of currency collapse. History shows that when the currency is dying, the stock market becomes the only place left to hide, creating a crack-up boom. But as the Bank for International Settlements, BIS, noted in their 2025 reports, this equity gap is a warning signal of extreme financial vulnerability. The 90% are staying in the market, chasing the last 5% of gains, while the elite are rotating into hard assets and private vaults. When the 2026 reset hits, the exit will be a digital bottleneck. Your 401k and your home equity will be the primary sources used to bail in the insolvent banking system. The timepiece is winding down. The middle class isn't being invited to the reset. They are the ones paying for it. The only way to survive the liquidation is to stop holding the paper that is designed to burn. The gold seizure precedent, EO 6102. The ink on a single piece of paper can erase the private property rights of an entire nation in less than 30 days. History is not a linear progression of freedom. It is a cycle of desperation where governments, when backed into a corner by debt, eventually turn their gaze toward the private hoards of their citizens. To understand the trap of 2026, we must perform a forensic autopsy on Executive Order 6102. On April 5, 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt didn't just ask Americans for help, he issued a criminal mandate. Under the guise of a national banking emergency, he ordered every citizen to deliver their gold to the Federal Reserve in exchange for paper notes that were about to be devalued by 40%. Today, the fiscal forensic evidence suggests that the legal scaffolding for a repeat of this event is already being reinforced. While the 90% believe that such an act is unconstitutional or impossible in the modern age, they are ignoring the existence of the Emergency Banking Act and the Trading with the Enemy Act, both of which remain on the books. More chillingly, Executive Order 114067, signed in 2022 and expanded through late 2024, has accelerated the research into a central bank digital currency. This isn't about innovation. It is about creating a digital ledger where the gold seizure of the future doesn't require a knock on your door. It only requires a single line of code to revalue your assets or restrict your access to them. The trap is being set using the safety narrative. In 1933, the government claimed they needed the gold to save the banks. In 2025 and 2026, the narrative will likely shift toward national security or stabilizing the debt. With the U.S. national debt now surging past $35 trillion and interest payments hollowing out the Treasury, the government is technically insolvent. History shows that insolvent empires do not go quietly into the night. They liquidate their subjects. The Bank for International Settlements, BIS, has already discussed unified ledgers that would bring all private assets, including gold ETFs and digital tokens, under the direct surveillance of central authorities. Most investors believe their gold ETFs or their bank-stored bullion are safe. They are walking into a trap of institutional custody. In 1933, the easiest gold to seize was the gold already sitting in bank vaults. Today, if your wealth is sitting on a digital platform or inside a major financial institution, you do not own it. You are a general creditor to an entity that the government can seize with a stroke of a pen. The elite understand this. That is why they are moving into self-custodied, non-reported physical assets that exist outside the digital cage. The timepiece is ticking toward a moment where possession is the only law that matters. Debt to GDP death spiral. The math of the American empire is no longer a matter of debate. It is a forensic certainty. In the cold, windowless offices of the Congressional Budget Office, CBO, and the IMF, the spreadsheets are flashing a warning that the mainstream media refuses to translate for the 90%. We have entered the debt-to-GDP death spiral. As of late 2025, the U.S. federal debt-to-GDP ratio has surged past 124%. To the casual observer, this is just a high number. To the forensic investigator, it is the mathematical point of no return. Historical analysis by economists like Reinhardt and Rogoff shows that once a sovereign nation's debt crosses the 90% threshold for a sustained period, economic growth is permanently stunted. But at 124%, the mechanism changes. You are no longer in a growth phase, you are in a liquidation phase. The interest on the debt is now growing faster than the economy itself. This is the definition of technical insolvency. We are effectively running a national Ponzi scheme where new debt is issued solely to pay the interest on the old debt, with zero productive capacity left to bridge the gap. To see the trap, we must bridge this to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. In the late 19th century, the sick man of Europe hit a similar mathematical wall. Their debt servicing costs began to consume over 50% of their total tax revenue. They tried to grow their way out, but the interest was a parasite that ate the host. Today, the Federal Reserve is trapped in a similar feedback loop. If they raise rates to fight inflation, they explode the government's interest bill. If they lower rates to save the Treasury, they trigger hyper-debasement of the dollar. There is no third option. The forensic stressor for 2026 is the CBO's 2025-2035 outlook. It confirms that net interest outlays will reach $1.1 trillion this year. This is the death spiral trigger. When a nation spends more on the ghost of money already spent than on its future, the currency is officially in hospice. Small investors are being told to stay the course in treasury-heavy portfolios, unaware that the collateral behind those bonds is a tax base that is already 100% committed to interest payments. You are lending money to a borrower who is using your loan to pay back the person who stood in line before you. The trap is being set by maintaining the illusion of GDP growth. But as the BIS, Bank for International Settlements, has noted, recent U.S. growth is almost entirely driven by government deficit spending. For every $1 of GDP growth we see today, the government is borrowing nearly $250. This is not growth. It is a terminal burn-off of the remaining capital. By 2026, the maturity wall will collide with this insolvency. 90% of investors think they are buying the safest asset in the world, but they are actually buying a front-row seat to the greatest mathematical reset in human history. The timepiece has hit the final red zone. The gears are no longer grinding, they are melting. When the 124% ratio finally snaps the credit market's confidence, the reset won't be a choice. It will be a mathematical necessity. Your savings, your retirement, and your purchasing power are the fuel being thrown into the engine to keep it running for one more mile. The only question is, will you stay in the engine room until the explosion, or will you find the exit before the 2026 hammer falls? The 10% survival playbook. The exit doors are narrow, and they are already being crowded by the same people who designed the room. While the 90% are pacified by index fund returns and the comfort of the status quo, the elite have activated a tactical exit strategy to move their capital outside the systemic risk zone before 2026. This isn't about beating the market. It's about surviving the hollowing out of the banking system itself. The forensic reality of 2025 shows a record-breaking rotation into private credit and hard assets, two sectors that exist largely outside the reach of the coming digital dollar and bank bail-in mechanisms. The primary move of the 10% is a shift from financial assets to real assets. As of late 2024 and 2025, the Goldman Sachs Family Office report and data from the IMF confirm that ultra-high net worth individuals have increased their cash and cash equivalent holdings to 20% of their net worth, while simultaneously moving into idiosyncratic private markets. They are exiting the public stock market trap, where their wealth can be frozen or taxed at the click of a mouse. They are buying the very things that the state cannot easily print or seize: productive farmland, energy infrastructure, and direct custody physical gold. To understand the mechanism of this playbook, we must bridge today's tactical exodus to the expatriation of capital from Weimar Germany in the early 1920s. Back then, the smart money didn't wait for the hyperinflation to peak. They moved their marks into Swiss francs and physical assets months before the collapse. Today, the Switzerland of the 2026 reset is the private credit market, which has exploded to $1.7 trillion in 2025. By lending directly to businesses through private funds rather than banks, the elite are bypassing the technical insolvency of the traditional banking sector. They are insulating themselves from the $337 billion in unrealized losses sitting on bank balance sheets. The trap for the 90% is the personal saving rate, which as of December 2025 has stagnated at a dangerous 4.7%. Most Americans have their entire financial life tied to a single fragile node, their local bank account and their 401k. They are betting on the systemic stability of a system that the Bank for International Settlements, BIS, has repeatedly warned is suffering from a liquidity vacuum. The 10% playbook requires the immediate movement of capital into anti-fragile positions. This means self-custody of physical silver and gold, moving into internationalized real estate, and holding significant liquidity outside the primary permissioned digital rails like FedNow. The final phase of the survival playbook is jurisdictional diversification. The elite are not just diversifying their assets, they are diversifying their legal existence. They are moving their corporate headquarters and family offices to regions like the UAE and parts of the EU that offer more favorable wealth protection frameworks. They are preparing for a world where the US dollar's reserve status is no longer a shield. By 2026, when the debt-to-GDP death spiral forces the government to turn its gaze toward the remaining savings of the middle class, the 10% will have already vanished. The timepiece is nearing its strike. The 90% are standing in the middle of a room where the floor is being removed, while the 10% are already across the bridge. The survival playbook is not a secret. It is hidden in plain sight within the data of the IMF and the BIS. The only question is, will you continue to hold the paper that is designed to burn, or will you follow the tracks of the exodus before the hammer of 2026 falls? The 47-day warning, Stage 6 anticipation. The collapse of an empire never begins with a roar. It starts with a calendar. While the 90% are focused on the next Federal Reserve meeting or the latest inflation print, the forensic investigator is watching a specific, ticking clock known as the Treasury General Account, TGA. In the final weeks of 2025, the U.S. Treasury's cash balance has become a volatile shadow of its former self, fluctuating wildly as the government hits the reinstated $36 trillion debt ceiling. This is the 47-day warning, a specific window of time where the extraordinary measures used to keep the government afloat run out of gas, leaving the global financial system precisely 7 weeks away from a total liquidity freeze. To understand the mechanism of this trigger, we have to bridge this to the panic of 1907. Back then, the entire American financial system was saved by a single man, J.P. Morgan, because there was no central bank to provide a backstop. It took 47 days for the initial bank failure in October to cascade into a nationwide shutdown of the credit markets. Today, the backstop is the problem. The IMF's October 2024 Global Financial Stability Report confirms that the interconnectedness between banks and non-bank financial institutions has created a maturity mismatch that can no longer be hidden. When the Treasury hits that 47-day X-date in early 2026, the Fed will have to choose between a technical default or a hyper-debasement of the currency to pay the bills. The trap is being set using the debt limit brinkmanship. As of late 2025, the Bipartisan Policy Center projects the government will exhaust its ability to pay all obligations by the first quarter of 2026. This isn't just about government shutdowns or national parks closing. It is about the maturity wall we analyzed earlier colliding with a borrower who has zero cash on hand. The forensic reality is that the 47-day warning is the moment the risk-free asset, the U.S. Treasury bond, officially becomes a risk-laden liability. Most investors believe the government will always find a way to pay. They are walking into the 2026 reset unaware that finding a way means devaluing the very dollars they are being paid back with. This 47-day window is the final opportunity for the 10% to move their capital into anti-fragile assets. History shows that once the trigger event occurs, be it a bond auction failure or a major bank bail-in, the exit door closes instantly. According to recent Treasury daily statements, the government's cash withdrawals are now outpacing its deposits by billions every single week. The timepiece is winding down. The 47-day warning is not a theory. It is a mathematical countdown to the second that the largest debt bubble in human history meets its expiration date. The timepiece final judgment. The countdown has reached its final seconds. While the 90% continue to operate on the flawed assumption that the future will look like a slightly more expensive version of the past. The forensic evidence we've uncovered reveals a system that is no longer capable of sustaining its own weight. From the $35 trillion debt limit to the quiet integration of FedNow and the mBridge project, every gear in the global timepiece has been precisely wound to facilitate a massive deleveraging event in 2026. This isn't just another recession. It is a fundamental shift in the nature of money and private property. The trap is now fully visible. It is built on the mirage of nominal stock market gains, the hollowing out of middle-class home equity, and a banking system held together by accounting tricks and $337 billion in unrealized losses. The elite have already performed their exodus, moving into hard assets and private credit that exist outside the digital cage, being constructed for the masses. History warns us through the ghosts of 1929, 1933, and 1971 that when the currency breaks, the government does not protect its citizens, It liquidates them to preserve the state. The math is absolute. You cannot grow your way out of a 124% debt-to-GDP ratio when your interest payments exceed your national security budget. By 2026, the collision of the maturity wall and the 47-day warning will force the largest wealth reset in human history. Most investors will wait for the news to tell them when to move, but in a forensic collapse, the news is the final layer of the trap. The only people who survive are those who recognize the strike before the hammer falls. The clock has struck. The gears have locked. The only question that remains is, were you watching the time? Or were you the one caught in the teeth?